Hello and welcome to this session on the outlook for quantum venturing in Europe. My name is Hal Hodson. I am the special project writer at The Economist, and very excited to talk to our panel about the sort of environment for fundraising and the state of the technology in quantum in Europe. We're joined by an excellent panel to talk us through this. We've got Chad Rigetti, who's the venture partner at QDNL Participations. His colleague Freeke Heijman, who's the co-founder and director of ecosystem development at QDNL. And we've also got Simon Groeblacher, who's the founder and chief executive of Qphox. Thank you all very much for joining us. So I think I want to start with just setting the scene a bit. Quantum computing, quantum technology has been around for a very long time. It's sort of, to my media head, it's a bit eclipsed at the moment by things like artificial intelligence. I guess I would like to get a sense perhaps from you, Freeke, to start us off, of what it is, what the opportunity is that QDNL sees. Why have you started this fund, if that's the right thing to call you now? And if you'd also just give us a little introduction to yourself and your business in answering, that'd be great.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. And I've started in quantum technologies 10 years ago already. So back at that time, the Netherlands was still fairly academic. So we had strong academic groups in, for instance, Delft and Amsterdam. But there wasn't that much yet of a business or venturing in quantum technologies. But because of the excellence that there was in the scientific space, and also already then there was a lot of excitement about the potential applications and the economy that might come out from this, the government, because my background is in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, so I have been working in tech policy, space policy for over a decade, and in that capacity, I helped launch QTech, which is a research institute in Delft, with the ambition to get from purely academic research to mission-driven research, and not only publishing papers, but really focusing on the technology to scale it. And ever since, so in this 10 years, the field grew immensely. So companies got interested. Other nations also got interested. Europe launched its flagship initiative. And I think that was fueled by both scientific advancements and the realization of both governments and businesses that this technology could really impact society big time. Because the applications, it's a very fundamental technology. So also the applications vary. So you have sensors, you have communications, you have computing, but they can impact a lot of industries and societies. And they also have a very strategic component to it. For instance, cybersecurity. And I think this fueled the interest. And the Netherlands were, well, I'm proud to say, a bit ahead of the curve, maybe, to invest in it from a government perspective. So we had this research institute. And then what we saw was also entrepreneurship ramping up. So there were a lot of initiatives within the universities that were ready to spin off. And I think that was the reason why we launched Quantum Delta NL. And that was around 4 years ago, to really get from purely R&D also to economic impact and to foster this commercialization effort.
Wonderful, thanks, Freeke. And Simon, you are running one of these commercial ventures. Tell us what it is you are trying to do.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, first of all, for having me here. I'm Simon Groeblacher. I'm a professor of quantum physics at Delft University of Technology. And as Hal just alluded to, I'm also the co-founder and CEO of a quantum technology startup company here in Delft. We call the company Qphox. So what we're doing is we're building hardware to enable scaling of quantum computers and essentially bring them to a size where they're of commercial interest and value. So this is one of the major challenges currently in quantum computing, is to build a system that is big enough So it doesn't just solve a problem that's theoretically not possible to solve with a classic computer, but we can actually have a real advantage in the quantum computation, and you can solve challenges, problems that are of commercial interest with a quantum system. This is something I think we're still a few years away, and with Qphox, we're essentially building kind of the backbone, the technology that allows to scale computers to bigger sizes, quantum computers to bigger sizes.
And Simon, just before I move on to Chad for his intro, one of the questions I often have that I feel helps set the scene is, what are quantum computers actually made of? If you think of a traditional computer, we know it's made from silicon chips. They're made in TSMC. You do the designs with an EDA tool. What's the supply chain for a quantum computer look like? Is it made with silicon chips as well?
That very much depends on the quantum computer itself. So there's many different technologies that compete to build the first quantum computer. So that range from trapped ions, where you essentially have an ion trapped in a kind of electrical field. There's also neutral atoms. There is, for example, superconducting qubits that are more based on for example, silicon chips with some metal superconductors on top that actually like allow you to build this kind of qubit. So it really depends very much on the kind of incarnation of your quantum computer. So it also will depend. So this also is kind of like how easy it is to scale a quantum computer. Very much depends on what kind of technology you want to use. There's different for every kind of these different implementations. There's different advantages and different drawbacks essentially. And none of them so far has really been able to scale to a size where they're big enough to really solve something interesting.
Gotcha. So there's a huge amount of diversity. Chad, tell us a bit about your role in this ecosystem, but also walk us through how you even begin to make investment decisions when you have such a diversity of sort of substrates that we're talking about here. We don't know which one is going to ultimately work. So how are you allocating capital?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very fascinating time to be an investor in quantum technologies, because, as you say, there's an extreme kind of variety of approaches being taken to solve the core technology challenges. So prior to becoming and focusing on being an investor and a board member and an advisor, I built one of the leading companies in the world in quantum computing, Rigetti Computing, and started that in 2013. We're a full stack quantum computing company and focused on producing, building and developing our own manufacturing capability and fab for the quantum chips themselves, integrating those into a full stack computing solution and delivering access to it over the cloud. This is really a predominant model in the way quantum startups and quantum computing hardware companies focus today. But at a high level, the way I think about the technology is you've got an entire global kind of information technology landscape that is largely extremely mature technologies that are produced through a supply chain that is in the end kind of highly concentrated through a small number of companies that produce the chips themselves, right? You mentioned TSMC because that's always the name that comes to mind when we think about how we produce contemporary computer chips. And there are just a handful of makers that kind of dominate this market. And ultimately, one of the opportunities in quantum is that, as Simon alluded to, the chips are produced in very, very different ways. It's still kind of chip level manufacturing, but it's driven by R&D today. It's not volume, and it's not shaped by the same forces that shape the traditional semiconductor industry. And so there's tremendous opportunities throughout the entire value chain of quantum information technologies, all the way from kind of the fab and the core fab infrastructure through to delivering of software applications and middleware software that allows the quantum technologies to work better, whether it's communication or sensing or networking. And so as an investor, I think what you look for are ultimately the talent of the core teams. I'm a very early stage investor, and our focus is at the kind of founding stage through to Series A. And ultimately, investment decisions at that stage are dictated by a deep understanding of what technology challenges exist to kind of break through to large scale and valuable commercial applications. combined with making a technical assessment of the capabilities of the core team, right, and the entrepreneurial kind of capabilities of that team. So it comes to early stage investing is ultimately about picking the right teams and then engaging actively to support them, to help them build companies, because great companies are built; they're not created from scratch, right? And it takes time, and it takes having the right large number of people around the table, and the core founding team is critical.
Gotcha. And, we're talking about a different way of building and running computers. And so I sometimes think it's helpful to go back to the sort of creation and growth of the current paradigm for computing. I guess call it CMOS, call it whatever you want. That started out as a solution to a problem. And the problem was that AT&T ran this massive telephone network in America, and the costs of maintaining that were really high when you use this old form of technology, these sort of these switches that were in vacuum tubes that were very delicate. And the transistor was, it was in part just a blue sky invention, but it was also, the idea was to make this cheaper. The idea was to make this more affordable. And I wonder if there's any analogies that you can think of, and let's start with you, Chad, and we'll go around. Like, what's the problem that quantum computing is setting out to solve today? The computing was invented to solve the problem that I just mentioned. What do we solve, or not computing in general, but silicon computing was invented to solve that problem, the AT&T running a network problem. What are the problems or big problem that quantum computing is setting out to solve?
You'll ask this question around the industry and get very different answers that depend on the kind of category or type of person you're asking. But look, at a high level, there's some high impact algorithms and applications that people are hoping to run one day that, if you could run them, would be wildly valuable, both economically and strategically. Things like Shor's algorithm that would, in principle, allow you to break secure communications, because you'd be able to crack the dominant cryptography codes and methods that are used today. But I think it's more fundamental and far deeper and broader than that. Ultimately, what quantum computing promises, from my perspective, is fundamentally leveraging a more fundamental and powerful theory of nature for how to build and devise and architect quantum information technology systems overall. That includes computing, and that's what kind of gives rise to the possibility of exponential or sub-exponential speed ups and accelerations. It also holds the potential to dramatically reduce the kind of energy consumption associated with certain computation, and ultimately to kind of bend the cost curve for advanced computing today. And I also think that we're very much in the early stages of identifying and figuring out what quantum information technologies can allow. There's still enormous space and room for creativity and figuring out new ways of leveraging quantum to solve new problems that we just don't solve today, because our entire experience of computing technology is classical. It's entirely dominated by that framework and how we're brought up with from the time that we first interact with information technology, all the way through our cutting edge algorithms and things like this. It's all dominated by a particular framework that doesn't include concepts of quantum. And so as that evolves that will take time. That'll take, that's kind of a generational shift that will happen as the technology matures and as people kind of grow up with it as being a familiar thing. So ultimately, I think what quantum information technology is going to do is reformulate this IT landscape that exists around the world slowly, surely, and kind of from a bottom-up way. And then you'll see high-impact applications start to emerge as the technology truly matures.
Can I ask you, Simon, for your answer to that same question? What is the problem that quantum technologies, quantum computing is sort of, maybe I totally see the answer is there's lots of different ones, but to your mind, what are the most promising ones? What are the ones that Qphox is built around solving?
No, really, really good question. So I think in contrast to classical computing, where you kind of had a problem that you wanted to solve, here quantum computing is kind of something that comes out of a very fundamental theory in physics. Quantum physics was something that was for a long time kind of a curiosity to explain very specific experiments and that we've seen in the lab. And so I think people started to then in the maybe 80s and 90s to really think about qubits. What can we do? Is there any practical applications that we can potentially solve with this? And this, as Chad mentioned, Shor's algorithm is one of the first kind of like things that people thought about that could be solved with kind of a computer based on quantum physics. So I do think there's still a lot to be discovered, so that we really just scratching the surface in what we will actually be able to do with a quantum computer. And I think this will really come once we have powerful enough systems that will be able to solve some very basic problems, some algorithms that we currently can think of. I think an obvious thing, for example, is kind of like protein folding, is kind of like understanding how nature works, like really complex systems in nature work, right? So this is something I think what quantum computers are really perfectly suitable for. And that's kind of just the beginning. And then we can think of much more complex problems that we'll be able to solve with a quantum computer eventually. And I think the question also goes way beyond quantum computing. For example, you can also think about quantum sensing, quantum communication. What are kind of the applications that you can have for some of these new technologies? And I think it's a similar answer, maybe some a little bit more advanced in communication, but I think there's a lot more applications we'll find for all of these kind of like areas in quantum technology.
Freeke, on the same theme to you, sticking with my perhaps somewhat shaky analogy to this older world of AT&T and transistors, the AT&T was a regulated monopoly, and so there was this fairly clear role for government in subsidizing, paying for innovation in service of making that system, that national monopoly system, more efficient. The information landscape that Chad's referred to today is far from any kind of a regulated monopoly. What in this world, in the world we're in, what is the role for states and governments' money in trying to support the sorts of innovations that we're talking about?
Yes, well, as the previous speaker said, this is a very fundamental technology. Quantum physics is a way to describe nature, and a classical computer doesn't resemble that. So if we manage to use that way of simulating nature to develop new materials, new drugs, this would be a tremendous impact on society. So I think that is, in the end, what makes all of us tick, to find solutions for big problems that we all see if you look around in the world. And I think states have a really important role to play, because to invest in R&D, to invest in fundamental science, in the end, it's still, at least in Europe, it's done by governments. So most of the funding still comes through governments into the academic field, and also still in the R&D technology development field. In the US, it's a bit different. There you have the big tech companies with very deep pockets who also invest in this space. But in Europe, these states are needed to invest in it. And also for the scaling of these companies, deep tech capital is needed. And in Europe, you have these sovereign wealth funds, for instance, who fund these kinds of venture capital funds. Well, we fund Chat's participation fund. So this is all very much needed. Also, as a launching customer, I think the example that you mentioned with the monopoly, it's a state actor that buys these new products, or it gives, so that's also something we need to do, buy these new sensors or buy these new communication networks and test them as sort of a launching customer from a public space. I do think, though, in Europe, we are sort of at the turning point. So it was mostly government funded up to now. But I think we are ready to, hit the private market. Because the technology is ready and the companies are ready, but also because, the situation in governments in Europe, it's not that positive at the moment. So we're looking at major budget cuts the coming years. So I don't think we can count on much subsidies or grants the coming years. So yeah, we're going to go out on the market.
Chad, come in on that for me, would you?
Yeah, I want to come back to the applications because I think it's the thing that needs to be focused on very much with quantum information technologies and specifically quantum computing. And in the end, this is a field that is so fast moving that there's advanced research going on in incredibly granular areas, whether it's applying quantum computing to molecular structure problems for drug design or materials design, as Simon alluded to, in biomedical applications and protein folding and larger molecules, all the way through to nuclear simulations, whether it's designing next generation reactors or weapons, potential weapons or things like this of strategic importance to nations, all the way through to computational finance, right? And things like Monte Carlo simulation and derivatives pricing. So what you're seeing is this, groundswell of effort to figure out how it is that you leverage these capabilities into these very, very specific kind of vertical application areas by a combination of quantum technologists and then practitioners on the other side, right? Kind of on the customer or user side, and often with some kind of academic or government support to try to catalyze that. And so overall, when that gets there, and there's things that need to happen for it all to get there, some of those applications are going to get there sooner than others. And as that happens, you're going to start to see a tremendous kind of acceleration in the level of investment and kind of capability development and how it starts to get applied into the industry and public sector.
Gotcha. And Freeke, I was surprised to hear you say that governments are pulling back from some of this funding and that's one of the incentives for increased private funding. I would have thought, but my sense of it is that governments are more interested than ever in having kind of control of or attempting to control or having a stake in a bunch of foundational technologies, including quantum technologies, but particularly artificial intelligence, semiconductors, electric vehicles. Then that a lot of that is driven by competition or perceived competition between states. Why are governments pulling back from this? And is it just quantum they're pulling back from, or are you talking about a broader trend?
Well, maybe it's because we have election day in the Netherlands, and I know what the political parties are saying, but like we have made this big investment, 600 million euros in the Netherlands a few years ago, and for the Netherlands, this is really a big amount. And you've seen France, and you see Germany, and you see more and more countries doing that, which is great. US has done it before, but at a certain point, you get to a point, okay, you're midway or further than midway of this program, and what's next? Is there going to be a next round of big investment? Or is it like, hey, we need the private entities coming in? And I'm just, also keeping ourselves sort of, lean and mean. And I just don't want to go back again to get new money all the time from the government. I just think we have to go out on the market.
And and this is sort of a question for all of you in turn, what are the most market-ready versions of the technologies that we're talking about? As you mentioned, there's sensors, there's algorithms, there's the compute itself. What are the things that are market-ready now that maybe if you're looking at the market, Chad, you're saying that's something I'm ready to put private money in now?
I think across the three kind of major pillar areas of sensing, communication, and computing within quantum technology, sensing is the most market ready. And, quantum sensors are being deployed today for real, in the field applications. Things like mapping the gravitational field or mapping the magnetic field to support navigation systems. These are things where the quantum technologies today meet the basic requirements to provide real end user value. Sensing is the most mature. It may be the smaller of the three markets, if you will, between sensing, communication, and computing. And next, I think computing is probably there. Is probably next in terms of most mature. But the use cases are so broad and so diverse, and the key work that is happening now, on the one hand, is advancing quantum computing technologies at the fundamental hardware level to meet the performance requirements needed for large scaling, while also solving some of the scaling challenges like the cost per qubit and physical limits to scaling and things like that need to still be addressed. In parallel with that, there's work happening on the algorithm side because everyone knows about Moore's law and what it means for semiconductor hardware, but also algorithms themselves, get better over time and often exponentially. So we make progress on figuring out better mathematical formulations and to leverage computing to solve practical problems. And so quantum algorithms are in the very early stage of their own kind of life cycle and development, continually getting better and finding more and more improvements, and also finding better ways of encoding information for computation on a quantum processor, leveraging hybrid with quantum and classical at the same time within a computation. And so the early applications that may have the more lenient requirements, if you will, maybe fewer qubits, it can tolerate slightly higher noise, are the ones that are really being focused on to kind of reach those breakthrough applications. It's an open game as to where those are going to appear and when. But I think people believe that there's this opportunity within the next 2 to 4 years to potentially show some initial commercial value, although a lot of work needs to be done and there's still risks that that's going to happen. And then longer term, there's reaching kind of error correction and fully fault tolerant systems that are a far lower risk proposition in terms of unlocking commercial value, but have a higher risk from a core technology perspective. They've got a longer timeline, they've got a higher cost associated with the development. And so as an investor, when you're allocating capital, I think it's making, a risk-adjusted kind of view of whether there's going to be a commercial market there available to the technology on a reasonable time frame, what the capital requirements and kind of, and the risk is associated with unlocking that. I would say we're at this very interesting time in the overall quantum effort, because for the first time, you can start to see business models where companies are developing capabilities for the pursuit of quantum technologies themselves, and this kind of circular, economy within the sector. And I think of things like software that is used to reduce error rates on the core qubits themselves, and or even error correction software is one that kind of goes in this direction of software that's going to run within the quantum computer rather than kind of on the quantum computer. And then finally, there's opportunities, I think, within how quantum computer, the hardware is developed in terms of service providers and, companies that can make money now with a bit of a picks and shovels model, but still have a very large upside when the technology kind of reaches a commercial breakthrough. So this is an interesting direction in quantum too that is now available, I think, for a lot of companies.
That last point is interesting. I think, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that one of the indications that this market or these technologies are maturing now is that there is a tool chain and there are products and companies that are not just saying we're going to use quantum computers or quantum sensing to do X, but we sell you a thing to help you run your quantum computer. And that this is a kind of picks and shovels argument for why there's a level of maturity today that hasn't been there over, in the last 20 years we've been maybe talking about this. Simon, it'd be great to hear a bit more about Qphox. Are you guys going to market today with a particular product? What's your roadmap look like?
So we don't have a product, a quantum product at this point yet that we're selling at the moment. We are definitely like a couple of years out before we can use the technology to bring to a customer. So we still very much in an R&D phase where we maturing a technology and bring it to a higher TRL level, where we can then hopefully in the next few years can deploy our system at our first customer. We do run pilot projects at the moment already, so we already work with some of the quantum computing companies in the market and essentially test our technology with their systems, with their qubits, and demonstrate that at least at a slightly lower maturity level, it already works, and we can interface with these quantum computers that exist already today. So that's kind of the rough, quick overview of where we are at the moment with the company.
And how do you find? I mean, the top line of this panel is about the European environment for this. I mean, we've kind of been setting the scene for the last few minutes. Tell us about your experience working within Europe, in interacting with governments and regulators. Is this something that you find they are sensible about, that they are supporting you appropriately? Are there things you would like to have more of or less of?
So I do think there is definitely a good level of support from governments. So there's always the two levels, right? So there's the European Union and there's the national states. And so I think, especially as we already heard from Freeke, there's a really big fund in the Netherlands that are early and supporting early stage quantum technology companies. So I think this is really great. There can of course always be more. So far, as a company, for example, we don't have a Dutch investor yet. So we have European investors, but no Dutch investor yet. So this could be, for example, something that we would be happy if that changes in the future. We do have European money, so the European Union already has invested into Qphox. I think there's really interesting programs to essentially help very early stage companies that are at a stage where you really think about a technology, where you have maybe a first demonstrator, but you're really far away from a product still. So this is something I think that works really well in Europe. I'm much more worried about the next phase. So going from TRL 5, 6 to something that you can deploy at a customer, where you need really quite a bit of capital to move to a proper product. That this is much harder in Europe than it, for example, would be in the US. It might be the grass is always greener, but I think I do think this is much harder in Europe. There's much less big funds that are willing to take a risk on a technology that's not mature yet, and where the market isn't 100% clear yet, what it's going to be, how big it's going to be. So I think taking this bet is something, and then setting this up in Europe is something that's going to be really critical over the next few years, such that the many small companies that exist today can actually mature and can have a competitive edge over companies in other countries.
Gotcha. And I want to come to you, Chad, in a sec on the sort of European risk attitude and how you see that compared to other regions. But Freeke, just the European governments and the European Union, do they see this as an opportunity? I mean, one of the narratives that this one is sitting within is this idea that Europe is behind in a lot of ways, right? Like you see European governments scrambling to set up battery factories, gigafactories. You see them scrambling to set up semiconductor fabs. Is there a sense that quantum can be some kind of leveler, that everybody's starting from the same place and we don't yet know what the ultimate sort of winners are going to be? So is there a sense that this is a more affordable opportunity to gain some leverage in a kind of global geotechnics?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the common understanding in Europe is that scientifically we're very good in quantum still. And there's also a lot of entrepreneurships, like startup companies like Siemens, but there are a lot, not only in Netherlands, but Finland, France, everywhere. So there's this, pool of talent, there's the knowledge. And for us, it's the challenge to do the scaling. And yeah, that's hard because we don't have the capital at this point. So there are less funds available for this scaling endeavor. But also, I truly see a difference in the risk appetite. I mean, yeah, the way in the US bets are placed on companies, yeah, it's just very different. And but everybody is aware of that, and there's a lot of efforts being done also to see how pension funds and others can be geared towards investing in this space. And funds like CHATS, but also Quantum Nation in France, there are dedicated venture funds that have deep insight in the quantum market and that they could lead these investment rounds. There's one sort of worry I do have, and that's the geopolitical fragmentation. I mean, we see a lot of walls being erected around investment policy, investment screening policies, inbound and outbound, and all kinds of rules you have to go through before getting investors on board, which makes it even harder, I think, for our company. So there's a lot of work to do. But in essence, yes, you're right. We feel that we have an opportunity where we missed out on other opportunities in tech.
Is it fair to say, Freeke, that for all the smart government policy and collaboration with industry, that in order to make this technology sort of work and commercialized and scalable, you need that healthy risk appetite and private money. You need to have that. You're not gonna have governments talking their way to a really healthy quantum computing ecosystem in Europe.
I totally agree with that. It's also the people, the way. I mean, governments are good in regulating and doing grants, but not in building an industry. Private market has to build an industry.
Okay, Chad, kind of bringing all of this to you with a particular focus on the risk appetite. Do you see signs of hope in Europe that this is going to change, or is it going to be the same old story that we've seen with other technologies over the years?
This is the enormous question. And I think I built my company in Silicon Valley, and intentionally placed it in Silicon Valley because I felt like that would give us a competitive advantage relative to other places to do it. And kind of my experience was in raising capital through early stage investment and then growth investment, and then ultimately taking the company public with public markets investors, but really centered as a Silicon Valley company. And then in Europe, what I've seen so far in my experience is that it's a very different ecosystem. So on one hand, for these early stage companies, there's tremendous technical talent in Europe that is second to none in the world in terms of the incredible scientists like Simon and his many colleagues at TU Delft alone is really an incredible place of fundamental innovation in science and quantum information. And there's also a real appetite, especially in the Netherlands that I've seen. There's a real entrepreneurial energy and an entrepreneurial appetite to take some risk and to build something. And those are the core ingredients that are needed ultimately. On the investment side, I think the situation is less positive, or another way to say it is less mature, right? And so ultimately backing companies like Qphox requires an ability to be comfortable with the risk profile and to be able to make good decisions about technology before there's evidence from customers and things like this. And what I've seen so far is that there's a real bias towards applying existing kind of mature business frameworks to deep tech by a lot of investors. It just don't work, right? They just fall apart. If you're saying, what's your revenue, what's your margin, how many customers do we have, what's our sales pipeline, and it's an early stage kind of breakthrough quantum technology company, you're looking at it through the wrong lens for that particular company, and you got to have the flexibility to kind of do that and shift gears a little bit. And then as you go to kind of thinking about scale up, there's tremendous tailwinds for European companies because of all these programs. The Quantum Delta National Program is one of them, but then there's also, as Simon mentioned, programs through the EU that provide substantial non-dilutive funding early on for entrepreneurs to spin out of a university, to get something going, and can provide the first, single-digit millions of capital to help get something going and make it happen. Now, it's not easy or free to get that money in terms of time, but it is non-dilutive. The applications can be incredibly onerous and maybe not incredibly transparent decision process and things like this, but it's non-dilutive capital that can help you get going. And the gap I see, and that's the opportunity I think as well, is that really capable kind of early stage investment in this deep technology area of quantum is lacking. And for the first time now, you're starting to see focus funds that are spinning up to kind of fill this gap. And it doesn't mean that every company ought to be raising Series A and ought to be raising Series B, but it does mean that for the really good companies, I think there's going to be capital there that is available to kind of meet their needs. And and looking at this from an investor perspective, and even an LP perspective in our fund, ultimately the different environment in Europe means that valuations do tend to be lower. The risk-adjusted returns are slightly, are favorable as a result. And you just don't raise at the same price as a European company as you do in Silicon Valley for all sorts of reasons that are real and legitimate. But it's a different market. It's just a different market. And so from a return perspective, I think it's a very promising ecosystem to be focused on. And I think there's the opportunity to build some really tremendous companies in the European environment right now.
This conversation is now really chiming with some of the reporting I've done on the British ecosystem, specifically most recently about life sciences. And the problem there is very similar discussion, right? Lots of great talent, lots of incredible universities, lots of interesting early stage companies. But then you get to this sort of growth hump And it turns out that all the money and expertise in handling that large amount of money is in America. And then you get this subtle gravitational pull. You get your Series A from America, and part of that is that, oh, we'd like you to have an office near us in blah, blah, blah. And then we'd let you have more and more staff there, and some of the growth of that company starts to go to the US. And then the US is a big market, and so you start to have even more of the growth go to the US. And I guess if I'm a European national government or the European Union, this is terrible. This means that all of I'm being a sort of black and white about this. It's much more complicated, but broadly speaking, this means that all of my grant funding, all of my good academic support, a lot of it's just bleeding growth to other places. And so I want to ask you, Simon, what do you, with Qphox, do you feel the pull of this gravitational pull of capital to America?
I think we don't feel that just yet. Of course, the US market is a very big market. I think we're still at a stage where we want to focus on Europe. We only have European investors. I think we have talked to American investors, of course. I think are currently happy where we are, but I think as soon as like the real growth phase comes, as soon as we really starting to be a scale up, I think the risk is, of course, that the money is not here in Europe, and then there's no choice but taking money from the US and then potentially also, of course, moving part of R&D and more to the US. And this is something, I know, as was mentioned, right? The European Union and national governments are investing quite a bit of money to get a lot of companies to the stage where they're ready to scale up. So it would really be a missed opportunity to then say like, okay, but then we leave it to everyone else and free market to just have the investment, the best investment from wherever it comes. And I think there the US with high valuations, more money will just always be appealing to European companies. And I also see a tendency that European governments try to counteract it with like restrictions on who can invest, how much they can invest. I really think that's the wrong approach. You just got to make sure that there is enough money, that the scale-ups are properly supported in Europe and have a good incentive to stay in Europe, and not because it's that they're not allowed to leave or anything. So I think having invested so much money, having the talent here, I think it's really important to make sure that the talent stays here, that the companies stay here by incentivizing them through good funds and easier money than currently is available.
And to be clear, just so for my own purposes, so I understand exactly what we're talking about, it's one thing to have American investors with American money in Europe investing in companies. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about the provenance of the money. We're talking, because the thing that matters in my reporting on other subject areas that I assume apply, but I'm kind of asking you guys, the thing that matters is when you get the 100 million from some investor, you also get their network, right? And when you get the if the network is in America, if the American money comes with an American network, then that's where you're going to get pulled. So it's not just a matter of attracting investment from overseas. It's a matter of unlocking local, in inverted commas, really, I guess I mean European. It's unlocking European money. Freeke, you mentioned pension funds. Like, to me, this seems a far more important issue than collaboration between industry and academia. Like, this is one of the big issues for any technology growth in Europe and the UK. You mentioned pension funds. What are the other things that governments ought to be doing, maybe that regulators ought to be doing, in order to unlock that European capital that wants to keep it's the technology and the IP and the skills that it invests in? It wants to keep them nearby for all of these much more subtle reasons.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with what Simon is saying. Protecting is not the way to go. So I think we need to build this ecosystem so that these companies who were born and raised in Europe also can take their next step in Europe, so that it gets less attractive to move. And this is hard work. It has to do with making sure the right people are on board, that the right advice is on board. People like Chad are into the ecosystem. And we do have good examples. I mean, in the Netherlands, you have ASML, we have Airbus in Europe. I mean, there are examples of that we are able to build tech companies. I think this capital thing, it's crucial, and it does have to do with legislation and regulations. For instance, there are already big sovereign funds that are state owned, and some pension fund money flows into that, but they are, for instance, not allowed to be a lead investor. So they say, hey, we have the capital, we're ready to back any company, but there needs to be a lead investor who leads the round. But then if there is no lead investor, then this money still is not flowing into the deep tech space. So these kinds of things that you can deal with. And I think Europe is doing a lot of things to get that working now with the European Investment Fund, EIC, EIB, and it's very high on the agenda. So I'm sort of hopeful, to be honest. And sometimes you also see the other way around, people from the US coming back to Europe, because I think Europe does also have advantages in the ecosystem as well. For instance, I think, maybe we have less risk appetite, but we also maybe are a bit more with the boots on the ground and realistic, so that could be a bit more sustainable in the growth of a sector and a company.
Chad, I mean, you're someone who came from America to Europe to some extent. Why?
Well, look, I think there's the venture ecosystem in quantum is far less mature in Europe as it is in the US. So you've now got venture funds that have been investing for a decade in quantum in Silicon Valley. And that just doesn't exist. And the kind of depth of talent, the depth of funds, the diversity of capital of different kind of sorts that's available in the US ecosystem is far deeper and broader than what I've seen available in Europe so far. I think coming back to the last point, there are tremendous opportunities at that A, B, Series C stage in not just in Europe, but in quantum overall, but specifically in Europe, because there's a paucity of growth stage capital. And with hard tech companies, quantum for sure, is kind of a poster child of this. Those Series A, Series B, and C rounds need to be raised in quantum off the back of technology progress and initial early progress with customers and commercial traction. Whereas for most companies, a Series A or Series B is getting into growth stage where it's a pure financial investment that looks a lot like the metrics are kind of private equity metrics, if you will, and can kind of be assessed from a spreadsheet often. And that's a good thing for those kinds of investments if that's the right approach. But in quantum technology, that doesn't work. By the time you get to Series A or Series B, you've proven something out, your technology probably works, but you haven't really fully gone to market yet. And you still need additional, resources to kind of get through it to the point where you're able to, map out a path to profitability. That's where a lot of hard tech companies struggle in those middle rounds. And in Europe specifically, because there's already a lack of growth stage capital and really good funds that are investing at that stage, I think there's a huge opportunity in quantum. And I think the ingredient that's needed is you need folks that understand what those stages are like, that can still assess the technology, but also have a sense for the business, right? So you can't just view this as a pure technology play anymore at that stage. The dollars are bigger, and you got to be, you have to assess the companies on their track record up to that point, as well as the likelihood that additional large chunk of capital is going to get them to major milestones and commercial breakthroughs.
I think it's telling that you said the dollars are bigger rather than the euros. What are the what's going to be the cost to Europe, to European governments, to people in Europe, to Europeans, if they don't sort of figure this out? What's the cost of the status quo? I mean, really to all of you, but maybe let's start with Freeke.
Well, I don't want to be gloomy about Europe's future, but if you look at certain economic figures, it's not looking good. For instance, the ICT sector, our market share, the European market share, I think it used to be 30% and now is back to 19%, 19, something like that. So, I mean, it's worrisome. I think we need to re-find a way where we have a stake of play in technologies that solve future and current problems of society. And I was in Geneva last week for a meeting, and it struck me because you walk in this beautiful city at the lake, etc., and the only thing you see are expensive watches, fashion brands, etc., which is wonderful, of course, but we're not going to solve world problems with that. So what's at stake? I think Europe's future is at stake. Europe's sovereignty is at stake. And yeah, to me, that's worth a lot.
Simon, you're in a meeting with someone with the power to change this. What are you telling them to do?
Look, I mean, I think there's many examples, many industries where Europe has kind of like missed the boat a little bit. Like big tech, I don't know, wind. There's many examples. I think that's where we used to be good, and then essentially now we're customers of global companies that are not in Europe. So I think this is really something we want to avoid in the quantum space. We want to be a technology leader in Europe, and we also, of course, want to work together with everyone else, but we don't want to just buy from other countries. So I think this is a great opportunity we have at the moment, and I think it would be really good to not miss that opportunity and really double down on quantum. It's a big risk. There's no promise that quantum computers will work. I think there's a lot of early signs that are looking really good. That we potentially have something that in a few years will be of commercial interest, but without some risk, you will not be able to make a big return of investment. So I think this is really a great opportunity for Europe and for getting this right this time.
Is this kind of what it comes down to, Chad? That the way you tell it, there's a big opportunity for European money because these European quantum companies are good, their people are good, their technology is good. They're undervalued relative to American peers. There's not a lot of competition in that growth stage capital. Like there's not a bunch of capital that wants in on these companies. There's certainly plenty of money in Europe sitting around. Is it that the people who control that money don't have the same risk appetite? And if so, is that even a problem that any government can solve? It seems like a cultural problem.
It's a great question and probably better suited for other guests on the panel here. I think, look, as these companies grow and scale, the best ones will make it, right? They'll find ways to raise a capital. I think inevitably these companies need to get into the U.S. market because the U.S. is the largest market in the world for computing technology and is going to very likely remain so. And the question is how can the capital base and the investors that succeed and grow and generate substantial returns from those winning companies, are they going to be the big Silicon Valley firms that kind of come in at an A or B or C to support the right companies, or are they going to be some European firms and with a European LP base? I think it makes sense if you're Europe to really focus on quantum for a couple of reasons. One is, look, there's a tremendous competitive position vis-a-vis the United States right now. And I don't look at competition with the US. It's really more of a global competition with China, honestly, is the way we should be viewing this. And I think, but if we don't, advance the European ecosystem appropriately and support the tremendous companies that are there and the tremendous science and technologists that are there, ultimately you're leaving that opportunity on the table and someone will take it. And that capital will, companies will get capital from somewhere, and you want to provide good options for them, and ideally through European funds with reputable investors. Yeah.
We're coming towards the end of our time. So I appreciate maybe I've steered us slightly gloomily. So to sort of start summing us up, Freeke, would you give us the kind of the golden goose version of what Europe's opportunity is here. Why is it in a good position? What are some of the big institutions we've mentioned to you, Delft? What are some of its chips in this big global game?
Yeah, well, I think to end on a positive note, we are still in an emerging market. So the jury is still out, and a lot of science and technology still needs to be done. So although Rigetti Computing, Chet's company, is much bigger and further ahead than the counterpart here in Europe, it doesn't necessarily mean that one will be, the end winner, so to say, because it's just a long way ahead. So I think we do have a lot of diamonds in play. And like Simon, but there are other companies as well, focusing on very critical components of this global supply chain. And I also do see the positive collaborative spirit in Europe now. Like President Macron was visiting us. We're launching this German, French, Dutch call now. So there's a real, sense of urgency to make this happen. And I do think we can do it. So this capital in Europe, it's there. We just need to reach out to them, communicate what the opportunity is, and get them on board.
So perhaps fair to say that to some extent, if you can't easily solve the scale-up capital problem, what you can do is invest a lot more in fundamental research that may, it's kind of a roll of the dice, but it may give you the widget that unlocks the market for you and that sort of solves some of your capital scale-up problems because you have the technology and nobody else. That is one way you can try and do this if you're Europe. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, that is keep on investing in the early stages, and the second thing is get this deep tech capital for the scale up phase as well.
Gotcha, and hope that Simon hits the jackpot in his continued R&D. Well, look, I think we're coming to the end of time. Nothing left to me to do than to thank you all very much for your contribution. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Thank you very much to our viewers for joining this Insight Hour with The Economist. And thank you very much, Freeke, Chad, and Simon for joining us.
Thank you.